Barbados, a jewel of the Caribbean, glimmered in the sunlight with its endless stretches of sugarcane swaying in the tropical breeze. To an outsider, the island seemed like paradise, bathed in golden light, with the sweet scent of sugar drifting across the land. But beneath this dazzling exterior, darkness festered. For those forced to toil in the fields, life was a relentless cycle of labor, brutality, and despair. The sugar plantations were not just agricultural enterprises. They were cages where human lives were bought, sold, and broken, often in full view of the indifferent colonial masters. The enslaved population, brought from Africa under the cruelest conditions, bore scars both visible and hidden, their bodies marked by whips, and their spirits tested by an unyielding system designed to strip them of every shred of dignity. From the break of dawn, the fields were alive with the sounds of suffering. Men and women bent over the soil, cutting the dense cane with machetes, their muscles screaming from exhaustion, their skin raw from the sharp blades and harsh sun. Children, far too young to bear the weight of such labor, were tasked with smaller, yet no less grueling chores, carrying water, tending animals, gathering cane leaves. Each day was a repetition of agony, yet within this torment, whispers of resistance began to stir. Among the enslaved, small acts of defiance flickered like fragile flames. A tool misused to damage equipment, a secret gesture of solidarity, a coded song in the fields carrying messages only the oppressed could understand. These subtle acts were the first seeds of rebellion, tiny sparks that would one day ignite a fire of resistance. Plantation owners lived in stark contrast to this suffering. Their grand houses, painted white and lined with tall columns, stood as symbols of power and wealth, a constant reminder of the disparity that defined the island. Their lives were filled with indulgence, parties, and luxuries unimaginable to those who labored endlessly under the sun. They employed overseers who were often as cruel as they were cunning, men and women who wielded authority like a weapon, ensuring that fear kept the enslaved in line. Punishments were swift and savage, whippings in public, forced kneeling under the blazing sun, or worse, beatings designed to leave permanent marks on both the body and the soul. Every act of cruelty reinforced the omnipresent surveillance, making rebellion appear almost impossible, a distant dream whispered in the dark. Yet, human spirit has a stubborn resilience, and even in the shadow of relentless oppression, hope endured. Within the hidden corners of the plantations, networks of communication emerged. Enslaved people spoke in whispers, using gestures and songs to pass messages without alerting their overseers. Families shared stories of far-off lands, of ancestors who had once been free, of heroes who resisted and escaped. These stories were more than mere tales. They were lessons in courage, blueprints for defiance, and reminders that even in the darkest circumstances, the human soul sought freedom. Some elders acted as clandestine mentors, teaching younger generations not just survival, but the art of strategy, observation, and discretion. The nights became sacred, a time when the oppressive gaze of the plantation receded, and the enslaved could meet, plan, and dream. The geography of the island itself became both a prison and a shield. Dense forests and hidden groves offered cover, secret paths wound between fields, and the moonlight cast deceptive shadows that could hide a group moving silently with purpose. These natural features became allies to those who dared to think beyond mere survival. The enslaved began to understand the land not just as a site of labor, but as a tool for resistance. Every rise in the terrain, every hidden hollow, every grove could be a meeting point, a lookout, a temporary refuge. Even the riverbanks and the mangroves whispered possibilities, places where messages could be exchanged, supplies hidden, and plans hatched without the ever-watchful eyes of the colonizers. It was within this environment of fear and cunning, suffering and subtle rebellion, that the leaders of what would become the infamous uprisings began to emerge. They were often ordinary people in appearance, farmhands, cooks, or field workers, but possessed extraordinary courage, vision, and an understanding of both human psychology and the brutal systems they resisted. Their leadership was forged in the crucible of oppression. They observed patterns, anticipated movements of the overseers and soldiers, and knew how to inspire hope without drawing suspicion. Among them, loyalty was sacred, betrayal lethal. They developed secret codes, signals, and rituals that bound communities together in ways that the plantation owners could never penetrate. The psychological tension was palpable. Every glance over a shoulder, every unexpected noise in the night, reminded the enslaved that the cost of discovery was death. Yet, it also sharpened their resolve. Living in constant danger honed their instincts, their cunning, and their patience. They learned to blend fear with hope, despair with determination, creating a resilience that could neither be quantified nor destroyed. Stories of small victories, evading punishment, successfully hiding supplies, or communicating crucial information spread like wildfire, creating a network of confidence and anticipation. These victories were never loud, never announced, but they were significant, planting the notion that one day, a larger strike could be possible. By the time the moon rose high over the sugar fields, its silver light bathing the plantations in an ethereal glow, the stage was set. Shadows moved in quiet synchrony, invisible to those above. The enslaved had learned the language of silence, the power of patience, and the potential of unity. What seemed like ordinary nights were charged with preparation, each whispered word a building block towards something larger, something that would shock the very foundation of the island's colonial society. The contrast between the visible luxury of the masters and the hidden, careful orchestration of rebellion among the enslaved was stark. It was a world split between the blinding glare of power and the subtle, dangerous flickers of resistance, a world where every breath, every step, and every glance could change the course of history. In these shadows over the sugar fields, the story of courage, cunning, and inevitable confrontation began to take shape, setting the tone for a tale of rebellion that would echo across generations. In the oppressive heat of Barbados, where the sugar fields stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, a subtle but determined form of resistance began to take root. The enslaved, though trapped in a world designed to crush both body and spirit, found ways to resist, to communicate, and to inspire one another with whispers of freedom. These whispers began as small, almost imperceptible acts. A broken tool left intentionally in the path of overseers, a hastily hidden note passed between friends, a song carrying messages encoded in rhythms and words that only the enslaved could understand. What might have seemed inconsequential to the planters was, in fact, the foundation of a larger, more organized effort. Resistance was born not in moments of open confrontation, but in these quiet, patient gestures of defiance, gestures that were shaping the minds and hearts of leaders yet unknown to the world. Among the enslaved, certain individuals began to stand out, not by virtue of privilege, but through intelligence, courage, and an uncanny ability to inspire trust. They were often ordinary men and women, some young, some older, yet each carried a spark that would later ignite a flame of rebellion. These leaders observed everything: the routines of the plantation, the patterns of the overseers, the weak points in the security of the fields. They spoke in code, in song, and through subtle gestures. Their leadership was quiet, almost invisible, but immensely powerful, as they were tasked not just with survival, but with preparing a community to act against a system far stronger and more ruthless than themselves. Every decision had to balance caution with boldness, because a single misstep could lead to brutal punishment or death. The creation of resistance networks required ingenuity. The enslaved relied on a combination of oral tradition, memory, and clandestine meetings to share information. Hidden groves, abandoned structures, and the dense undergrowth of the island became secret meeting places where men and women could gather without fear of being watched. There, they discussed strategies, assigned tasks, and passed on knowledge that could be used in a future uprising. Leaders would instruct others on how to move unseen, how to blend into the fields, and how to respond to threats swiftly and decisively. Every encounter, every piece of information exchanged, became a thread weaving a tapestry of defiance. These networks were fragile yet vital, and their survival depended on discipline, secrecy, and mutual trust. The psychological complexity of these emerging leaders cannot be overstated. They lived dual lives, by day, obedient laborers, by night, strategists and planners. They bore the weight of their people's hopes, knowing that the consequences of failure would be devastating. Yet the fear, rather than paralyzing them, sharpened their senses and honed their decision-making. They had to anticipate betrayals, foresee the movements of soldiers, and inspire confidence in others who were often weary, broken, or doubting. Their bravery was quiet, often unseen, yet it was the kind of courage that would later make legends of them. Every action taken, every plan conceived, carried with it the potential to alter the course of history, even if it went unrecognized at the time. Small victories in defiance were celebrated in secret. A sabotaged cart, a hidden stash of food, or a successfully evaded punishment was not merely an act of rebellion, but a demonstration of possibility. Each success, no matter how minor, reinforced the notion that the enslaved were not entirely powerless. Stories of these victories spread by word of mouth, weaving a sense of community and shared purpose. The enslaved learned from one another, observed one another, and found ways to encourage those whose spirits were paling under the weight of oppression. These acts, seemingly small, created ripples that would later transform into waves of coordinated resistance. Communication remained the lifeline of the rebellion. Songs, chants, and even the rhythm of work in the fields were coded with meaning. Overseers might hear the tunes and rhythms, but remain oblivious to the messages they carried. Elders and experienced leaders taught the young how to interpret these signals and how to pass them along without raising suspicion. The network was an invisible web, delicate yet resilient, capable of surviving the harshest scrutiny. In the dead of night, beneath the watchful gaze of the moon, messages were exchanged, plans were refined, and confidence was cultivated. Every whispered word, every subtle nod or gesture was a testament to ingenuity in the face of oppression. The societal context of Barbados at this time heightened both the danger and necessity of resistance. Colonial laws were designed to strip the enslaved of autonomy and instill terror. Public floggings, mutilations, and hangings were tools of psychological warfare, intended to prevent any thoughts of rebellion. Families were torn apart, marriages ignored, and children sold away without warning. Despite this, the enslaved refused to surrender their agency entirely. They found solace in community, strength in secrecy, and hope in stories passed down about ancestors who had resisted before them. These narratives were not only historical, they were a blueprint for survival, a mental map for daring acts that could challenge the system itself. The leadership that emerged was not uniform. It was diverse, adaptive, and deeply human. Some were charismatic speakers, others tacticians who understood the land and its hidden paths. Some inspired with their moral authority, others through sheer daring. Each contributed to the collective intelligence of the underground movement, demonstrating that resistance was not the work of a single hero, but of a community united under a common purpose. They learned to coordinate with precision, plan with patience, and act with calculated timing. As this network of resistance solidified, the enslaved began to envision the impossible, not merely survival, but a confrontation with the very system that sought to destroy them. Every secret meeting, every shared song, every coded gesture contributed to the formation of a cohesive strategy. By the time the first open acts of rebellion would unfold, these leaders had already spent months, perhaps years, building the invisible machinery necessary to strike. They were not reckless. They were meticulous, patient, and deadly in their preparation. In these moments, the birth of resistance was no longer a quiet whisper. It was a rising force, one that would soon erupt in defiance under the moonlit skies of Barbados, challenging centuries of oppression in a single, audacious strike. As darkness fell over the sprawling sugar plantations of Barbados, a tense quiet settled across the fields, broken only by the distant hum of nocturnal insects and the rustle of cane leaves in the wind. The moon, nearly full, cast a silver glow that transformed the landscape into a tapestry of shadows and silhouettes. It was in this deceptive tranquility that the enslaved leaders had chosen to act, turning the very night itself into a weapon. Every step had been planned, every movement rehearsed in secrecy, and every participant knew that the slightest miscalculation could mean death. The ambush was not just an act of rebellion. It was an intricate dance between patience, precision, and courage, a culmination of months of observation, planning, and silent communication. The leaders of this clandestine operation were keenly aware of the stakes. Soldiers patrolled the plantations with deadly efficiency, their muskets glinting in the moonlight, their discipline honed by years of maintaining control over the enslaved population. But these soldiers, confident in their authority and underestimating the resourcefulness of those they oppressed, were about to walk into a trap. The insurgents had studied the routines, noting every predictable patrol, every weakly guarded path, every moment when the soldiers' attention wavered. They had trained in secret, using hidden clearings and groves to simulate the movements and attacks they would execute under the cover of darkness. The tension was palpable. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation, every breath measured, every sound amplified. When the moment arrived, the ambushers moved like shadows among shadows. They used the natural terrain to their advantage. Rising hills, dense clusters of cane, and the folds of the land provided concealment as they crept toward their targets. Their weapons were simple yet effective: sharpened machetes, axes, and whatever tools they could transform into instruments of defiance. But it was not sheer force that gave them power. It was the element of surprise, the discipline to wait for the perfect moment, and the intimate knowledge of the land that allowed them to strike where the soldiers were most vulnerable. Each participant understood their role, the timing, and the signals that would initiate the ambush. Hesitation was fatal, yet despite the danger, courage thrummed through every nerve. The first clash was sudden, almost surreal. The soldiers, accustomed to dominance, were caught off guard by the sudden emergence of figures from the shadows. Panic spread quickly among them, amplified by the realization that they were no longer in control. Chaos erupted. The sound of musket shots, screams, and the clash of metal against wood filled the night. Yet amidst the carnage, the insurgents maintained a terrifying composure. They moved strategically, attacking and retreating in coordinated bursts, exploiting the confusion with precision. Every maneuver had been rehearsed, every ambush point planned to maximize impact while minimizing exposure. The moonlight, which could have revealed their positions, instead illuminated the chaos in a way that disoriented the soldiers further, blurring lines between friend and foe. The psychological impact on both sides was immediate. For the soldiers, the attack shattered confidence, replacing arrogance with fear and uncertainty. For the enslaved, each successful strike reinforced belief in their agency and capabilities. The leaders themselves were a mix of emotions: fear, adrenaline, determination, and an almost otherworldly focus. Every moment required split-second decisions, balancing aggression with caution. The Moonlight ambush was as much a test of nerves as of skill, a scenario where courage and cunning were inseparable. The insurgents relied not just on physical prowess, but on anticipation, psychological insight, and the unwavering trust they had cultivated among themselves over months of preparation. The details of the engagement were both horrifying and awe-inspiring. Soldiers fell, some fatally, others wounded and disoriented, while the insurgents pressed forward with relentless precision. Blood mingled with the damp soil, cries echoed across the fields, and the night became a chaotic theater of defiance. Yet even as the violence unfolded, the insurgents adhered to their plan, retreating through prearranged escape routes, disappearing into the shadows just as quickly as they had struck. Their knowledge of the land, hidden hollows, forested edges, and narrow paths, allowed them to vanish from view, leaving bewildered soldiers behind, unsure of the full extent of what had just occurred. This ambush was more than a tactical victory. It was a symbolic act, a statement that the enslaved were not mere property but thinking, strategizing human beings capable of challenging a brutal system. News of the attack, whispered in secret across plantations, spread fear among the colonists and inspiration among the enslaved. The audacity of striking under the moonlight, in the very heart of the oppressor's territory, left a lasting mark on the psyche of the island. For the leaders, it was both a triumph and a sobering reminder of the stakes. They had demonstrated their power, but the consequences would come swiftly and brutally from a system that tolerated no challenge. Even as the night ended and the first rays of dawn painted the fields in gold, the tension did not dissipate. The ambush had set events into motion, awakening a response from colonial authorities who would retaliate with extreme force. Yet in those precious hours, the insurgents had achieved something profound. They had rewritten the boundaries of possibility, showing that the enslaved could act with agency, strategy, and courage. The moonlight, which had illuminated their strike, became a symbol of both risk and hope, a silent witness to a rebellion that would echo across the island for generations to come. The ambush under the moon was a turning point, both practically and psychologically. It revealed the vulnerabilities of the oppressors, the ingenuity of the enslaved, and the terrifying potential of organized resistance. Every whisper of the event, carried secretly from one plantation to another, fanned the flames of rebellion, planting ideas of courage and defiance that could not be entirely extinguished. This night of calculated violence was more than history. It was a story of strategy, audacity, and human resilience, a moment when the shadows themselves seemed to rise against oppression, forever altering the narrative of power and resistance on the island of Barbados. The morning after the moonlit ambush, the plantation lands of Barbados were filled with a tense, oppressive silence. The soldiers, humiliated and shaken by the audacity of the attack, returned to their barracks, their fear mingling with anger. Colonial authorities, alerted to the events by frantic overseers, were swift to plan retribution. The ambush had not only injured their pride, but also challenged the very foundation of the slaveholding society. They knew that failure to respond with overwhelming force could inspire further rebellion, and so their wrath was meticulously prepared. Orders were given for patrols to scour the fields, for militias to hunt the insurgents, and for punishments to be delivered in public as a stark warning to anyone considering defiance. The enslaved felt the looming shadow of retaliation immediately. Those who had not participated directly in the ambush were terrorized by the sudden presence of soldiers moving through the plantations, questioning, searching, and punishing indiscriminately. Families were torn from their homes. Men were beaten in public, and women were threatened or assaulted as a tool to instill obedience. The aim was clear: instill fear so deeply that the thought of rebellion would seem impossible. Yet, in a grim irony, these brutal measures often strengthened resolve. Witnessing such cruelty forced the enslaved to confront the stakes of resistance, while also recognizing the power of their collective action, however dangerous it might be. Executions and floggings became instruments of psychological warfare. Those identified as ringleaders, or even suspected of sympathizing, faced death in the most public and grotesque ways. Some were hanged from the tallest trees near the fields, their bodies left for hours as grim lessons to all who dared imagine escape. Others were subjected to severe beatings, their pain amplified by the knowledge that punishment extended to their families or friends. The overseer's cruelty was precise and intentional, designed to fracture community bonds and isolate potential insurgents. And yet, despite the horror, many in the enslaved population watched and learned, internalizing lessons about survival, evasion, and the limits of colonial power. The psychological toll of this retribution was immense. Fear became a constant companion, infiltrating thoughts and dreams. Those who had participated in planning or executing the ambush had to navigate a new reality where betrayal might come from anyone, where the safety of allies was never guaranteed, and where every decision carried mortal consequences. Trust, previously a quiet strength within the resistance, now became a delicate balancing act. The leaders understood that patience and discretion were more vital than ever, that even the smallest misstep could unravel everything they had built. The constant threat of discovery heightened tension, sharpened senses, and forced a hyper-awareness that permeated every aspect of daily life. At the same time, the brutality revealed the limits of the oppressor's morality, exposing a system sustained by fear and violence rather than justice. Plantation owners, while indulging in their opulent lifestyles, were compelled to maintain strict discipline through terror, showing that the human cost of wealth was measured in suffering. The enslaved, despite their terror, began to perceive cracks in the seemingly invincible structure of power. Soldiers, though armed and trained, were vulnerable to strategy, cunning, and surprise. The oppressor's confidence, shaken by the ambush, became a quiet ally to those plotting resistance, providing hope that the system was not infallible. In these days of reprisal, stories of the ambush spread quietly among the enslaved. Tales of courage, audacity, and cunning were shared in hushed voices, in hidden corners, in moments when the overseer's gaze was diverted. These narratives, even as fear permeated the air, reinforced identity, pride, and solidarity. They were reminders that the enslaved were more than victims. They were active participants in shaping their destiny, even if the cost was immense. The leaders, though forced into hiding or constant vigilance, drew strength from this growing network of support, understanding that their actions had left an indelible mark, inspiring both hope and caution. Reprisal also reshaped the physical landscape. Fields were patrolled more rigorously, boundaries tightened, and pathways once used for secret communication were blocked or watched. Natural hiding places were destroyed or made unsafe. Yet, with every attempt to suppress resistance, ingenuity emerged. The enslaved learned to adapt, to find new routes, to develop subtler signals and more sophisticated strategies. The cycle of violence and cunning created an environment where survival required constant observation, planning, and resilience. Fear became a tool not just of the oppressors, but also a catalyst for sharpening the resolve of those who refused to surrender their spirit. In the end, retribution was as much about demonstrating control as it was about punishing the insurgents. Yet its impact was paradoxical. While it inflicted unimaginable suffering, it also highlighted the bravery of those who had dared to act, the strategic genius of the leaders, and the potential for defiance in the most oppressive circumstances. The horror of punishment, the public display of terror, and the calculated cruelty of the authorities served as a dark mirror, reflecting both the cruelty of the colonial system and the unbroken courage of the human spirit. The enslaved population learned that resistance was perilous, but possible. Every act of violence from the oppressors was met with a quiet, simmering defiance in hidden hearts, proving that courage and resilience often thrive even in the bleakest of shadows. Through this grim period of reprisal, the foundations of future resistance were laid. The enslaved learned to move more cautiously, communicate more effectively, and trust selectively. Their leaders, though hunted and under threat, became symbols of courage and intelligence, reminding their communities that rebellion was not just about force, it was about strategy, patience, and unity. The cycle of ambush, retaliation, and adaptation hardened the community's resolve, transforming fear into a sharpened awareness that would guide future acts of defiance. In this crucible of horror and retribution, the human spirit endured, resilient and unbroken, waiting for the moment when hope would again rise against oppression. Amid the terror and chaos that followed the Moonlight ambush, certain figures emerged as the unseen architects of rebellion. Their names whispered cautiously among the enslaved, but feared by the planters and soldiers alike. These leaders were not born with titles or privileges. They were ordinary individuals whose extraordinary vision and courage transformed ordinary suffering into coordinated resistance. Some were field workers, blending effortlessly among their peers, while others held roles that allowed them subtle oversight, enabling them to observe patterns of control and exploit weaknesses in the colonial system. What united them was not rank or wealth, but clarity of purpose, an unshakable commitment to the liberation of their people, and the intelligence to navigate both the visible and invisible layers of oppression. These leaders operated in absolute secrecy, their identities hidden even from those not immediately involved in planning. Trust was a currency more valuable than gold, and betrayal could mean instant death. Every message was coded, every meeting clandestine, every route mapped with precision. They understood that visibility equaled vulnerability, and yet, paradoxically, their influence radiated outward like ripples across a pond. Every whispered instruction, every subtle gesture, every strategically placed signal served as a thread weaving the broader network of insurgency. Their genius was not merely in acts of violence or rebellion, but in the creation of an intelligence system that allowed disparate groups to act in unison without exposing themselves to detection. Psychologically, these leaders were fascinating studies of duality. By day, they endured the harshest labor, their bodies pushed to exhaustion under the unforgiving sun and the lash of overseers. By night, their minds were alive with strategy, calculation, and the orchestration of defiance. Fear was a constant companion, yet it never overcame them. Instead, it sharpened their instincts, forcing them to think several steps ahead of their oppressors. They mastered the art of concealment, not just of their movements, but of their intentions, emotions, and knowledge. To outsiders, they might have appeared compliant, unremarkable even, but beneath the surface, they were calculating, teaching, inspiring, and preparing for the moment when action would become unavoidable. Their leadership manifested in multiple forms. Some were brilliant tacticians, studying patrol routes, timing, and terrain to maximize the effectiveness of ambushes. Others excelled in the subtle art of communication, ensuring that messages passed through layers of secrecy without raising suspicion. A few were moral leaders, capable of inspiring hope and unity among weary, terrified communities. Each contribution was vital, proving that resistance was not dependent on a single act of bravery, but on the coordinated efforts of many minds, many talents, all aligned toward the singular goal of survival and defiance. The complexity of their leadership rivaled that of the colonial authorities, yet it was born from necessity, forged in oppression rather than privilege. The leaders' ability to inspire loyalty was equally remarkable. Among the enslaved, word of their bravery and ingenuity spread quietly, carried through hushed conversations, coded songs, and clandestine gatherings. They became symbols of possibility, living proof that resistance was achievable despite the overwhelming odds. This psychological influence was as important as any physical act of rebellion, for it fortified the spirits of the enslaved, giving them courage to endure punishment and hope that their suffering was not in vain. Even when the leaders themselves were forced into hiding, their presence lingered, shaping behavior, encouraging caution, and reinforcing the belief that collective action could challenge even the most brutal of systems. The leaders also demonstrated extraordinary adaptability. They learned to read the ever-changing moods of overseers, anticipate unexpected inspections, and adjust plans accordingly. Each setback, whether a failed attempt or a narrowly avoided discovery, was treated as a lesson rather than a defeat. They refined strategies, developed new communication methods, and trained others in the delicate balance of secrecy and initiative. Their actions were marked by patience and precision, revealing a deep understanding that rebellion was not merely about immediate victory, but about sustained resistance over time. Every decision was weighed against potential consequences, with survival and long-term impact always in mind. Even in the face of extreme danger, these hidden leaders nurtured community cohesion. They recognized that rebellion required more than weapons and tactics. It required trust, solidarity, and moral courage. They mediated disputes, encouraged mutual support, and instilled a sense of shared purpose that transcended individual fear. Their leadership was as much about psychological endurance as tactical brilliance, teaching their followers to withstand oppression without surrendering their humanity. Every act of guidance, mentorship, or reassurance contributed to the broader resilience of the enslaved population, ensuring that the seeds of resistance continued to grow even under the harshest conditions. By revealing the hidden leaders, the narrative transforms from a story of anonymous suffering to one of intentional strategy, courage, and human ingenuity. These individuals were not simply reacting to oppression, they were shaping it, bending the conditions of captivity into opportunities for defiance. Their brilliance lay not only in the planning of ambushes or the coordination of secret networks, but in the moral and psychological guidance they provided. They became the spine of a movement that refused to bow, the architects of a resistance that would echo across generations, and the silent heroes whose actions would haunt the conscience of oppressors for years to come. In the end, these hidden leaders remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, extraordinary courage can emerge. They teach that leadership is not a matter of visibility, status, or recognition, but of vision, courage, and the capacity to inspire others to act in pursuit of justice. In Barbados, under the relentless sun and beneath the watchful eyes of oppressors, these unseen figures shaped history, proving that the human spirit, when guided by strategy, loyalty, and moral clarity, can defy even the most terrifying systems of control. Theirs was a leadership born of shadows, yet it illuminated a path toward freedom, hope, and enduring resistance that no brutality could fully extinguish. Long after the Moonlight ambush and the brutal reprisals, the events on the sugar plantations of Barbados left a mark that extended far beyond the immediate horror. The uprising, though violently suppressed, reverberated across the island, shaping the consciousness of both the enslaved and their oppressors. It became a story whispered in secret gatherings, passed from one generation to the next in hushed tones, songs, and coded gestures. These echoes were not merely tales of fear or violence. They were testimonies to courage, resilience, and the unbroken human spirit. Even as the colonial authorities sought to erase these acts from official records, the memory endured in the hearts of those who had lived it, ensuring that the story of resistance could never be fully silenced. The psychological impact on the enslaved population was profound. The audacity of the ambush and the brilliance of the hidden leaders created a blueprint for hope, a reminder that oppression, no matter how absolute, was not insurmountable. People began to understand that while fear could shape behavior, it could not extinguish the longing for freedom or the capacity for strategic defiance. Families and communities internalized the lessons of courage, observing the ways in which small, disciplined acts of resistance could ripple outward, creating larger opportunities to challenge the status quo. The uprising became a symbol, a quiet yet powerful assertion that humanity could not be fully broken, even under the harshest conditions. Historians later noted that these events also exposed the fragility of the colonial system. Despite the soldiers, the overseers, and the strict laws designed to maintain order, a small, determined group of individuals had demonstrated that organization, intelligence, and audacity could unsettle the seemingly invincible structure of control. The rebellion illustrated the limits of fear-based authority, showing that the system's power relied not solely on weapons or law, but on the belief that the enslaved would remain passive. The ambush shattered that belief, leaving colonial authorities both shocked and more vigilant, a dual reaction that underscored the potency of even a single night of coordinated rebellion. The hidden leaders, long shrouded in secrecy, became enduring figures in the collective memory of the enslaved. Their courage and strategic genius inspired subsequent generations to continue resisting in subtle, quiet ways. Even when overt uprisings were impossible, these lessons guided everyday survival, communication, and defiance. The acts of bravery were not merely historical events. They became part of a living culture of resistance, shaping attitudes and expectations for those who came after. The insurgents' ingenuity proved that leadership and influence did not require visibility or recognition, only vision, courage, and unwavering commitment to a cause larger than oneself. Cultural transmission played a critical role in preserving these memories. Songs, oral histories, and folktales carried coded accounts of the rebellion, describing both the audacious acts and the moral strength of those involved. Even in the absence of written records, the stories survived, embedding themselves in the consciousness of the enslaved. These narratives served as lessons, warnings, and inspiration. They reminded listeners of what could be accomplished through unity, planning, and courage, and they underscored the importance of vigilance and discretion. In a society where formal education and literacy were denied to the enslaved, oral tradition became the vessel through which history, strategy, and hope were passed down. The physical landscape of Barbados also bore silent witness to the uprising. The cane fields, rivers, forests, and groves where secret meetings and ambushes had occurred became hallowed spaces, etched into the memory of communities. These locations were more than geography. They were symbols of ingenuity, survival, and resistance. Every hidden path and secluded grove reminded the enslaved of both the danger they had faced and the victories they had achieved. The terrain itself became a participant in the story of rebellion, shaping strategies, concealing movements, and serving as a reminder that the natural world could be an ally in the struggle for freedom. As time passed, the narrative of rebellion took on a dual character. To the colonists, it was a cautionary tale, a reminder of the consequences of underestimating those they oppressed. To the enslaved, it was a source of pride and inspiration, a testament to the power of courage, intelligence, and solidarity. The tension between fear and admiration, suppression and remembrance, highlighted the complex legacy of the uprising. It showed that history is not a single narrative but a mosaic of perspectives, each shaped by experience, memory, and survival. Ultimately, the echoes of the uprising endure not just as a historical account, but as a reflection on the resilience of the human spirit. The hidden leaders and their followers demonstrated that even in the bleakest circumstances, individuals could organize, inspire, and resist with intelligence and courage. Their actions became a moral and psychological benchmark, reminding future generations that oppression, no matter how overwhelming, can be challenged. The Moonlight ambush and its aftermath were not simply events of the past. They were enduring symbols of defiance, hope, and the unyielding pursuit of freedom. In every whispered story, every remembered song, and every hidden grove, the echoes of Barbados' rebellion continue to resonate, shaping both collective memory and the enduring belief in human agency against tyranny. The story of rebellion in Barbados does not end with the ambushes, reprisals, or hidden leaders. It continues in the way these events illuminate the human capacity for resistance under extreme oppression. Reflection on these acts reveals a truth that is both timeless and unsettling. Courage often arises not from comfort or safety, but from conditions so dire that inaction becomes unbearable. The enslaved on Barbados, confined within a system designed to strip them of agency, demonstrated that resilience is not merely survival. It is strategy, intellect, and an unyielding moral imperative. Even in their darkest hours, they found ways to communicate, plan, and act, turning the very mechanisms of control against their oppressors. Their resistance was as much psychological as physical, a testament to the ingenuity of those who refused to be dominated completely. The leaders of these uprisings embody a paradoxical combination of patience and audacity. Their brilliance lay in understanding that overt action required meticulous preparation, yet they also possessed the courage to act decisively when the moment arose. In studying their methods, one sees a deep understanding of human psychology, not only of their enemies, whose patterns and weaknesses were exploited, but of their own people, whose fears, hopes, and motivations had to be carefully nurtured. Leadership, in this context, is inseparable from empathy and strategy. The ability to inspire trust and coordinate action while under constant threat is an extraordinary achievement, highlighting that rebellion is not merely about force but about vision, discipline, and moral authority. Resistance in Barbados also challenges common narratives of power. The colonial system relied on the illusion of total control, on fear, and on the unquestioned submission of the enslaved. Yet the ambushes, secret networks, and acts of defiance reveal the fragility of authority that depends solely on violence and intimidation. True power, the uprising demonstrates, emerges from knowledge, unity, and strategic action. Those who appear powerless can wield influence in ways that destabilize even the most rigid hierarchies. In this light, the enslaved leaders were not simply reacting to oppression. They were shaping it, bending the rules of their confinement to create openings for action and asserting humanity where the system sought to erase it. The ethical and psychological dimensions of resistance are equally compelling. The ambushes and uprisings involved real risk and real suffering. Leaders and participants faced moral dilemmas, weighing potential lives lost against the imperative to challenge injustice. Their decisions were not abstract. Each choice had immediate consequences for themselves, their families, and their communities. This moral complexity adds depth to our understanding of rebellion, revealing it as an inherently human endeavor, full of fear, calculation, courage, and sometimes sorrow. Acts of defiance were never simple victories. They were ethical and strategic gambles, born from necessity and informed by experience. Reflection also invites a meditation on memory and legacy. The stories of these uprisings have survived despite deliberate attempts to erase them from history. Oral traditions, songs, and family narratives preserve the memory of courage and cunning, passing it to subsequent generations. These accounts shaped cultural identity and provided moral instruction, illustrating that resistance is not solely an event but a living, evolving force. Every retelling reinforces the idea that even when physical freedom is denied, intellectual and spiritual autonomy can persist, influencing thought, behavior, and community cohesion long after the immediate events have passed. The rebellion in Barbados also highlights the universality of the struggle for freedom. While rooted in a specific historical context, the dynamics of courage under oppression resonate across time and geography. Human beings, when confronted with extreme injustice, often seek to reclaim agency, whether through clandestine planning, overt defiance, or acts of solidarity. The enslaved on Barbados exemplify this universal truth that resistance is not bound by weapons, territory, or social rank, but emerges wherever dignity and life are threatened and where vision and strategy meet opportunity. Moreover, reflection allows us to see the psychological power of hope as a tool of resistance. Even when faced with unspeakable cruelty, the enslaved maintained belief, sometimes fragile, sometimes steadfast, that action, unity, and courage could change their circumstances. Hope, combined with intelligence and planning, became as powerful as any weapon, sustaining morale, fostering trust, and enabling bold moves against seemingly insurmountable odds. In this way, rebellion was not only a physical contest, but a profound psychological struggle, one in which mental resilience was as vital as any blade or machete. Finally, these reflections urge us to consider the enduring lessons of such histories. The uprising in Barbados demonstrates that oppression can never fully extinguish the human spirit. It shows that resistance is complex, multidimensional, and deeply human, involving courage, strategy, morality, and communal bonds. The hidden leaders, the audacious ambushes, and the persistent defiance of the enslaved provide a moral template for understanding power, agency, and the capacity to act under extraordinary circumstances. Their story is not merely historical. It is a mirror, asking every generation to reflect on the nature of courage, the meaning of freedom, and the enduring capacity of ordinary people to confront injustice and reclaim their humanity. In the shadows of the sugar fields, beneath the glare of colonial authority, the story of Barbados' resistance remains a testament to human resilience. It reminds us that the struggle against oppression is never solely physical, never solely immediate, but a continuum of courage, ingenuity, and moral determination. Even centuries later, these reflections inspire, provoke, and challenge us, demonstrating that the echoes of resistance continue to shape the conscience of humanity, and that in every act of courage under tyranny, the human spirit shines, indomitable and eternal.